how wildly expensive some therapists are. Some therapists are really out here like buying the bullshit that they're selling with these rates that they're charging. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey, I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapy things on this channel. Today, we're talking about the most therapy thing of all, which is why is therapy so fucking expensive? This is a question that a lot of people have. It seems to be like a pretty common gripe on the internet. And so I wanted to talk about this and shed some light on the situation and sort of like add some nuance here, blah, 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 all of the things. Before we do that though, you might notice that I'm wearing a super cute little shirt because this is my merch. And if you want to buy this shirt or any of my other merch designs, the link is in the description. You can go buy one. And also, if you are unaware, I launched a Patreon. And so if you want to become a patron and get access to a bunch of other fun stuff, we have exclusive merch that lives only on Patreon. We do fun Q&As and live streams and exclusive video content and things like that. The link for that is also in the description to become a patron. So that's it. That's pretty much it. Let's talk about therapy and why it's so expensive. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the difference between insurance and self-pay therapy, because there is an important distinction there. And a lot of people have questions about why therapists tend to not take insurance, especially in private practice. The other thing that I wanted to give as a little caveat right off the bat is that we are talking about this issue primarily as it relates to private practice because I have not worked in community mental health for long enough to feel comfortable discussing this topic in that realm at length. There are many, many, many other people on the internet, I'm sure, who have discussed this or have talked about their experiences with community mental health and can shed light on that issue in a more educated way than I can. And so I'm talking about this based on my lived experience and the things that I know to be true. I don't want to put my whole ass behind something that doesn't actually resonate with my lived experience. So food for thought. This is like sort of half of the conversation because the other half is the sort of behavioral health agency, community mental health realm that's very different than private practice. So take that for what you will. In terms of the like self-pay versus health insurance issue, the long and short of it is that a lot of therapists in private practice move away from accepting health insurance for services because it's difficult, it's a pain in the ass, it's not very lucrative, and oftentimes it tends to just be more trouble than it's really worth. When we talk about self-pay versus insurance, basically what I'm talking about too is just the phenomenon of therapists saying like, I don't accept your insurance and so you can pay me X amount of dollars out of pocket for every session, versus like the more traditional model of a therapist accepting your insurance plan. They take your little card, they run it to the insurance company, and they tell you your insurance company told me you owe me a copay in the amount of X amount of dollars every session. The complicating factor here, I actually have a whole video about the difference between self-pay and insurance, and so I will link that up here if you want some more clarification about that issue, because we're not going to delve into it too much. But the complicating issue here is that insurance plans tend to fluctuate a lot. There's a lot of like up and down and back and forth, and especially with the insurance company, it's very common for there to be what's called fee adjustments, basically where the insurance company comes back and says like, hey, remember when we paid you like X amount of dollars for this session on this date at this time with this person? We were wrong. We paid you too much and we want that money back. Or for them to say like basically the client ends up owing more money. And it's just like a whole snafu. It can be very confusing and frustrating. There's also the phenomenon of people's deductibles resetting every year, people's co-pays changing or their co-insurance amount changing. Insurance companies are also allowed to audit you, essentially. It's a relatively common experience, or like it's a possible experience for an insurance company to say, hey, we noticed that you're billing us X amount of dollars for all of these like 60-minute psychotherapy sessions. We want proof that those 60-minute sessions that you billed us for actually lasted for 60 minutes. So give us all of your documentation, prove to us that you actually did the thing that you said that you did, and we're withholding your payment in the meantime until you do that. And so then the therapist is like sort of up shit creek. You're not getting paid for the work that you've already done. And you basically just have to like do this whole rigmarole of like faxing and sending, and it's kind of a nightmare. There are so many other issues with accepting and using health insurance as a means for payment in psychotherapy. These are like just a couple, but this is why we see the phenomenon of therapists, especially therapists who are more experienced or who have worked in the field for a very long time, gradually moving away as they practice longer and longer from health insurance because it just becomes more of a burden than it's really worth. So this kind of brings us to the next point that I wanted to talk about, which is that insurance companies are kind of fucking over therapists in a way. This is a very complicated and nuanced issue, and so I want to be clear, by no means is this video intended to be like the end all be all of like all of the therapy and insurance questions, but there are a couple of systemic issues here that I wanted to talk about because I think especially therapy consumers don't tend to hear about these things or know about these things. Therapists also don't really speak about these things. There's a lot of like weirdness about money. We really don't like talking about money for some reason, and I'm just like, who cares? So I want to talk about it for that reason because I think it's helpful in like educating like why the thing is the way that it is. First and foremost, I want to talk about the disparity that exists between the payment rates for psychotherapists and psychotherapy services and other specialty healthcare services. Psychotherapy is considered a healthcare service, and that's not to say that psychotherapists are medical professionals because that's not necessarily true. However, psychotherapy is considered a medical service, and that's why we're allowed to bill health insurance companies for it. When we look at the payout rates for psychotherapists versus other specialty fields with similar amounts of education, psychotherapists tend to be on the receiving end of payouts that are just less. This is a fucking problem, in my opinion. There are a couple of reasons why. There's not really like a hard and fast reason or rule about why this is the way that it is. It's personally my opinion that health insurance companies just don't value services like psychotherapy and especially things like preventative care as it relates to mental health. And so we see a like disproportionate barrier to access with these services. And the unfortunate impact of that is that the consumer has a much harder time justifying these services, gaining access to these services, and being able to utilize these services for a long enough time. The other thing that I want to talk about here too is that it's common for health insurance companies to put a limit on the number of sessions that a client can access. And so that's another reason that therapists will move away from health insurance, but can also be an issue because if we are, working through a particularly difficult case and a client's health insurance only covers 8 sessions or 10 sessions, at the end of that exchange, when you run out, basically, the question becomes like, fucking now what? Like, are you paying fully out of pocket for these services or are you discharging? And this is a burden that the health insurance company is putting on the therapist and on the consumer that doesn't need to exist. These barriers to access don't, they do exist for other specialties, but especially for things like preventative care with your primary care physician, for example, like we don't see that happening because the health insurance company feels justified in their ability to like potentially save money in the long run by having you go get a physical every year and do your blood count and like all of that fuckery, but they don't value the use of mental health care as like a preventative or like protective service for your overall health, which is a fucking issue. The other thing that I wanted to talk about here is that the payment rates for psychotherapists vary from health insurance company to health insurance company. Some of them are great. Well, some of them are okay. And some of them are real fucking bad. In my experience, I don't know if this is true for everyone else, but I have seen personally one of the payment rates or the payout rates for a 60-minute session be as low as $45, which is fucking rough. And I know, especially for folks who work like hourly wages in the service industry and things like that, $45 an hour sounds like fucking fuck yeah, like I want to do that, right? But it's important to acknowledge again that like other specialists in the medical field are not being compensated at $45 an hour essentially, and also that there are additional costs that exist with being a psychotherapist, and so there are just like issues here. So the main issue here is that the health insurance companies really should be paying or like willing to pay for psychotherapy services, but oftentimes they're not, or they make it so difficult to access the payment for those services that therapists don't want to do it anymore because it's so burdensome that it's no longer worth it. And then the cost of that gets redirected onto the consumer. And so clients, you are the people who end up bearing most of the burden for this issue when it's not really like therapists or clients' fault. It's health insurance companies that are choosing to not value the service in the way that it should be. I hope that makes sense. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about here, sort of like in defense of therapists a little bit, because a lot of times when we talk about especially the self-pay model of therapists who've chosen to no longer accept insurance benefits, you know, charging like, I don't know, $150, $200 out of pocket for a session, a lot of people balk that amount and they're like, kind of like, what the fuck is that? Because people are very quick to sort of calculate like, okay, well, if this therapist is getting paid $150 an hour, or $150 a session for 60 minutes, that means they're getting paid $150 an hour. Like, why am I paying you that much money for 60 minutes? Like, you must be like, you know, God's gift to therapy, basically. And I hear that. I don't want to downplay what a significant fucking amount of money it is, and how wildly expensive some therapists are. Some therapists are really out here, like, buying the bullshit that they're selling with these rates that they're charging. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to act like $150 a session isn't like an exorbitant amount of money, because it is for a lot of people. However, I also want to talk about the costs that are associated with being a therapist, because I think it's important as just like a sort of perspective shift for folks to keep in mind when we talk about like why the service costs as much as it does. So for example, if you pay a therapist $150 for a session, the thought is commonly like, okay, well, I'm paying you, like, why am I paying you $150 for this 1 hour session? The reality is that you're actually paying that therapist for the time that you spend in the office with them, but you're also paying them for the time that they spend writing a progress note, writing and updating your treatment plan regularly, writing and updating your mental status exam, all of the time that they spend billing and invoicing your sessions, or the cost of paying someone else to do it for them. And then anytime that you guys spend corresponding in between sessions about canceling, rescheduling, and things like that. Other things that are associated as costs here are like the sort of commonly expected ones, like the cost of leasing an office, the cost of like keeping the fucking lights on and the internet, supplies, like paper and printer ink and a computer, but also things like liability insurance. Therapists have to pay for liability insurance and sometimes general liability insurance, depending on what their office leasing situation is. You're also paying for the cost of your therapist maintaining their license and their continued education units, which can be in the thousands of dollars for every licensure period, depending on how long each state is different for your licensure period. Also, potentially the cost of hiring and maintaining like a bookkeeper or an accountant or things like that. The cost of quarterly taxes or self-employment tax, which for reference is usually about 30% of your income if you are self-employed. And then also things like trainings, treatment manuals, other like supplemental materials that we're providing to our clients. And don't forget about the cost of paying back our fucking student loans. And so when we add all of this up, we're really talking about a pretty significant amount of money that a therapist has to sort of put on the line in terms of keeping a practice open. And so I know that this can sound a little bit like, I think we should get paid a fucking shit ton of money. And like, again, I want to be clear. I know that the amount of money that some therapists are charging feels inappropriate and like so inaccessible, because it is inaccessible for a lot of people. But it's not to say that the therapists are like necessarily unjustified in wanting to be compensated for, you know, like a minimum of like 6 years of education, 3 to 5 years of clinical experience, and then however many years of experience they have on top of that, and all of the work and like effort and time and money that they've put into their practice, into their ability to be a good psychotherapist. The other thing that I wanted to talk about here is the difference in perspective that exists for therapists versus other medical professionals. Therapists oftentimes, and like social workers and people who work in the sort of social services industry, are oftentimes held to a very different standard than people like doctors or dermatologists or ENTs or whatever, because there's this attitude that like, well, the work is sort of emotionally fulfilling, and so that should be enough for you. You should be willing to work for less, basically, because you're like, you are doing this out of the goodness of your heart, you know? And so like, that should be enough. You shouldn't have to make a bunch of money. In my opinion, that's kind of a dehumanizing sentiment, and it's also disingenuous. Therapists are human beings, and it's, I think, a fair expectation to want to achieve financial stability, and the ability to like own a home or raise kids or, you know, I don't know, pay off your fucking student loan debt, not be operating on like a paycheck to paycheck basis based on all of the years of education and the time that you've put in. And so I want to encourage people to practice a little bit of a perspective shift here, because it's less common for people to say things like this or to have this attitude towards, other like medical professionals and people in that sort of field than it is for people who are social workers and therapists and things like that. We love our work. We love what we do. Don't get me wrong, but it is also fair and okay for therapists to want to be compensated. Yeah, that too, actually. Therapists have to go to therapy like so much, you guys. We are going to therapy, at least good therapists should be going to therapy like all the time. And that's just expensive because it takes a special kind of therapist to therapize a therapist. And like that shit doesn't come cheap. So also that's what you're paying for too. The last thing that I wanted to talk about here is how to find accessible and affordable therapy services, because again, I want to recognize and honor that therapy in the mental health field historically has done a really bad fucking job at being accessible to people. However, that's not to say that you can't be in therapy or it's impossible to find a therapist if you don't have the means to just sort of pay out of pocket for, one of the sort of fancy pantsy ones. I want to be clear, some of the resources that I'm going to mention will not work for everyone, and that's okay. It can be very frustrating and very soul-sucky to try and find a therapist that is like the sort of good mix of like vibes with you. You can afford them, they have the availability that you need, and you're not on a waiting list for like God only knows how long. And so I super duper want to validate the frustration there. Everyone is very much allowed to feel how they feel about the state of the mental health industry, but I want to pass along the resources anyways because I do think that they're genuinely useful. The first thing that I want to talk about is sliding fee scale services. This is something that kind of exists across the board. You will see this most commonly in places like behavioral health agencies and community mental health, where based on your income, you qualify for a reduced fee per session or for the service. But this also is something that therapists in private practice will utilize. Sometimes therapists have a certain percentage of their caseload that they're willing to work with people on a sliding fee scale basis or on a pro bono basis, depending on the situation. And so those are questions that you can ask, especially if you're approaching someone on private practice or in private practice. Like if you find someone on Psychology Today, Therapy Den, those places, and you want to see if their rates can be adjusted, I would encourage you to ask in your consultation email, hi, my name's so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. These are the issues that I'm working with. I'm hoping to find a therapist that I can access sliding fee scale services with because I don't have a lot of financial resources. Is that something that you provide? Usually therapists will list it on their profile too. So the other thing that's sort of like related to that's like an offshoot of that is Open Path Collective. That is one of the therapist search engines that's always linked in my description because it is a search engine with the focus of finding therapists who use sliding fee scale services. And so it tends to be one of the more affordable options, or like one of the first places that I suggest people look when they have that limitation. Another good resource is university counseling programs, because all therapists have to learn how to be a therapist somewhere. And so if you are okay with working with someone who is currently in graduate school or in like a predoctoral program or whatever to be a psychotherapist, then those services can be much more accessible, especially if you live in a big city or in a state with a lot of public universities. Like here in Arizona, we have 3 big ones. And with the advent of telehealth, it's a lot easier to see people through those means. And so that's an email that you can very much send and just say, hey, just reaching out to see if your counseling program offers reduced rate counseling sessions to people who aren't students of the university because I'm looking to get seen for blah, blah, blah. Behavioral health agencies are also a great resource. This is something that you can literally just type into Google, like therapy near me, and usually you'll see community mental health agencies pop up. The caveat here is that usually there's waiting lists. Sometimes people have negative experiences with these things. And so like, again, I don't want to send anyone out into the world with like the highest of expectations that these services will be amazing, because sometimes they are and sometimes they're not, so like exercise an attitude of caution, use a discerning eye. Definitely don't be afraid to advocate for yourself in those scenarios if you need to. Grant funded programs are also a great resource. Anytime you see the words grant funding, inquire about what that means, because sometimes that means that the clinicians or the agency have received a grant from either the state or the federal government, with which they're allowed or able to compensate the therapist so that the money doesn't necessarily have to come directly from you. So you're receiving therapy at a lower cost rate. And the other resource that can be useful is to look for services with an associate level clinician. So somebody who's an LMSW, somebody who's an LAC, these like acronyms where basically somebody has the standards or has met the standards to be a psychotherapist, but they're not independently licensed yet. Typically those fees for services, you know, command a lower dollar amount. And so that can be a good resource too. That's all the resources that I have. There are other therapy search engines also listed in my description that do have filters that you can use to narrow your cost for services too. And so if that's a resource that you're looking for, please feel free to use them in the description. Generally, I really want to encourage folks to keep an open mind with accessing therapy services, because again, this is a complicated and systemic issue. A lot of times the blame gets sort of cast onto therapists individually and specifically, when in a real world, a lot of the burden for this issue is like a systemic one. And so, I don't want to like be the person who's like, don't be mean to therapists, but also like, it's like I said, it's a systemic issue for what it's worth. I hope that this was useful or helpful. I know that people will probably have like thoughts and feelings about this, so please feel free to leave your thoughts and feelings in the comments. Let me know if you guys have other questions. If anyone has any additional resources for finding low-cost therapy, please feel free to put those in the comments. I will happily pin a comment if it has a good resource in it, and or edit the description for that. So like the video if you guys like the video, subscribe to the channel. We have educational content like this, but we also do a cute therapist reacts moment every now and again, and share the video to help the channel grow and help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.